Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. So you're thinking of breeding boas. You've seen all of the episodes that I provided on how to breed boas, but now I want to answer the question, should you breed boas? What are the justifications or the considerations you should make before going down the path to becoming a boa breeder? So please stay tuned for some hopefully useful information. So particularly if you're new to boas, you probably noticed that there's kind of this obsession in the boa hobby with breeding. You know, you just wanted to get a pet boa, but you realize that these people are obsessed with breeding and somehow they all aspire to be breeders, and it doesn't really make sense to you. You know, and I completely understand where you're coming from. I have pet dogs and cats. The last thing I want to do is breed them, and when I got them from my local humane societies, they were actually neutered and spayed, so I couldn't breed them. I've even seen people who have purebred dogs that, they might want to think about breeding, but they have no interest in breeding them, and they wouldn't understand just the whole mentality that goes into breeding, the way that reptile keepers have this obsession with breeding. And for some reason, you've probably seen that people are just kind of acting as though breeding is like the central thing in the reptile keeping hobby. But how did it get this way? Well, it kind of makes sense if you think about it historically, because if you go back a few decades, back before the 80s, actually really before the 90s when people really started to breed in larger amounts, not too many people were breeding reptiles, and reptiles had not been worked out as far as exactly how to breed them. So there was still a lot unknown. There's still a lot unknown today, but back then there was even more unknown, and there really weren't a lot of reptiles to go around. Most of them were being taken from the wild, and there was a limited supply of animals that you could continue to take out of the wild. So there was a lot of pressure for people to breed. And it kind of made sense. And going back then, before the 90s, the reptile industry was completely different. There really wasn't even a reptile industry. It was kind of more of a mom and pop type of operation. And there were lots and lots of species. There were hundreds and hundreds of different species that people worked with. It wasn't until the late 80s when people decided, or the market decided collectively, that there was going to be just a handful of key species that people are going to focus on. And we all know these well, things like ball pythons and boa constrictors and carpet pythons and Burmese pythons and corn snakes and leopard geckos and bearded dragons, and a few others. If you go to Morph Market, you'll see that there's really about 24 categories that, the vast majority of animals fall under. And so these kind of became the ideal species to work with for a number of reasons, and people stopped worrying about all these other species, which in many cases have completely disappeared from herpetoculture, unfortunately, as that may be the case. And so there was this need back before this whole transformation happened around the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and we went into this whole reptile industry, and there was definitely a need for more people to be breeding. So people would always recommend, don't get a male, don't get a female, get a pair. You always want to get a pair of babies so you can eventually breed them and you can keep the hobby going. But of course, once people figured out how to breed these animals, and it became pretty much a cookbook, you just follow a recipe to breed them. Pretty much anybody could do it just by following the recipe, and suddenly there were lots and lots of extra animals, and there was never a need for more animals, particularly with respect to some of the more easy to breed species like ball pythons, corn snakes, leopard geckos, etc. The types you see in mass at the local reptile shows. And so the whole reptile industry kind of changed fundamentally in around the early 90s when it transformed into this, what we know today. The other main thing that transformed the reptile industry about the same time was this shift over to morph animals. People were really just concerned about morphs. They wanted to breed lots and lots of different morph variations of just a few species like the leopard geckos, ball pythons, corn snakes, etc. And, those are really the two main shifts that happened to the reptile industry. But of course, when you have lots and lots and lots of animals, there's not really a need for everyone to breed them. And so what made sense a few decades ago just doesn't make sense anymore. And really, people should not be nearly as obsessed with breeding as they are. And really, we should think about this hobby. These are pets, okay? We're getting animals as pets to keep because we enjoy interacting with them and looking at them and studying them. But that's the primary reason here we're getting these animals, is they're pets. Okay, we're not getting them to make money. We're not getting them to save the world. We're not getting them to, save them from extinction. We're getting them because they're pets. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And that should be your first reason for keeping a reptile, in my opinion. And so there's absolutely no reason for you to need to breed these animals. Keeping an animal as a pet is completely a good enough justification. You don't need to breed them in order to save them, because there's enough to go around these days. And in fact, you may very well be much happier just as a collector of reptiles. And often I think about, well, what if I hadn't become a breeder of boas? What if I had just tried to get animals that were of the species that were interesting to me, and I only aspired to have maybe one or two of each? Different lizards, tortoises, snakes, maybe invertebrates, a lot of variety. Sometimes I wish I had that instead of all these boas, because since I've decided to specialize in boas and put all of my eggs in that basket, they're pretty much all that I have, other than a handful of pythons. So it's really a compromise. If you decide to work with just one species and go into breeding them, chances are pretty good you're not going to be able to work with lots of other species that you might be interested in. Another unfortunate side of this obsession with breeding that is part of the reptile hobby is that people have this idea that only if they breed and are successful as a breeder will they have obtained a high degree of competency and a high level of placement, so to speak, in the whole reptile hobby. And that's really not true. There's a lot of ways that you can enjoy your reptiles other than breeding them. So as I mentioned, just having a reptile as a pet should be the primary objective, and just enjoying spending time with them and observing them. It's also, reptiles can be used to educate others. So you can use your reptiles to go to lectures or presentations or even kids' birthday parties, things like that, educating them about nature and about reptiles. In addition, you can use reptiles artistically. You can use them as photography subjects, or you can even do art of them, paintings of them. Even some people use snakeskin as a medium of art. And there are a variety of ways you can enjoy the hobby without ever breeding them. So there's not this need for you to breed in order to obtain a high level of success in the reptile hobby. And so I think a lot of people that have been in the hobby for a while, they see somebody that's relatively new and they're really enthusiastic, and they decide they're going to jump on the breeding bandwagon. And even though they've only been keeping snakes for 6 months and only have maybe a ball python and a boa, they decide they're going to go down the breeding rabbit hole. And so generally speaking, the reaction to these types of people on social media is not positive, and they're kind of, in some cases torn apart by some of the more experienced keepers. I don't think that this is really a good reaction either. So obviously we don't want to be in a situation where there are too many reptiles that are being bred, that there aren't enough homes for them. Okay, but we have to think, is the fact that somebody expresses an interest in breeding, even though they're new to the hobby, is this likely to have an impact on that and cause this huge glut of excess reptiles to be available on the market? You have to think about what are the likelihood that they're actually going to be successful at breeding. And that, of course, is going to be different when it comes to different types of animals. And most of you guys who watch the channel, I know most of you guys are into boas. If you're not, you should be, if I'm doing my job correctly. But a lot of you guys out there want to breed boas. Some of you guys are already breeding boas, hopefully. But probably I would venture to say that at least half of you guys are trying to breed boas, or headed in that path. And so that's great. I think it's great that people want to work with these animals. I 100% hope you're successful. I hope you can use the information that I disseminate in this channel to achieve that success. But the fact is, very few of you are going to be successful. And I know this because I've seen so many people come and go over the years. People that get into the hobby full steam ahead and then for whatever reason they're not successful as a boa breeder, the vast majority of them never even have a litter, which I'm going to talk about the reasons why in a couple of minutes. But even those who are successful and do have a few litters, they just get so burnt out with the whole process, and it's just can be just so draining sometimes that they don't really last long as a breeder. So it's very, very highly unlikely that, most of the people who watch this channel are going to go on to become, big boa breeders. And I would never expect that. So don't feel any pressure to breed unless you really want to, in which case I hope, like I said, that you're successful. So if you see one of these relative newbies on Facebook who decides they want to announce for the world that they are aspiring to be a boa breeder, just wish them the best of luck, because as I mentioned, their odds of becoming successful as a boa breeder are about the same as someone who decides that they want to be the next rock star or A-list Hollywood actor. It's highly, highly unlikely. Even if they, really, really try and put in a lot of hard work, they're going to need to have, the right luck, and they're going to need to have a lot of talent. And I think the same thing is true with breeding boas. I would say breeding boas is nowhere near as profitable or as sexy as being a rock star or an actor, but it probably has a similar level of success when you look at all the people who are interested in doing that and the percentage who actually make it. It's really not that high, and not nearly as glamorous as I said, or as profitable as some of those other aspirations. And I know that the number of people who make it is really not that great, because I've seen over the years lots of people come in and they say that they're going to breed boas, but you look at the number of people at any given time who are successful as a boa breeder, it's not that many. Not that many. It's a very, very small percentage of the total number of people who keep these beautiful animals. I'm not going to try to throw out any numbers. I'll let you reach your own conclusions. But very, very few people who set out to breed boas are successful. So, if you want to aspire to do that, that's great. The aspiration is probably about, 1% of the equation. The remaining 99% is just hard work and persistence, and really a single-minded goal to breed boas. And so with that in mind, I thought I'd end the video with just a few tips that if you are one of these people who has recently gotten interested in boas and you're aspiring to breed them, just things that you should really consider. And so the first is to take your time, because a boa breeding project is typically a 5-year project between when you get your babies and you grow them up and they're ready to have the first litter. So it's a very long-term project. I think that's one of the main reasons a lot of people don't make it, is they just can't last 5 years with the focused energy towards breeding the boas, and they give up before they even have their first pairing. The next is to do your homework, get all the information, do a lot of reading, watch a lot of videos, talk to a lot of people. You really want to get all of the common knowledge that's out there these days, which is really valuable, to allow you to breed your boas. The next is to master the husbandry first. So you shouldn't even think about breeding boas before you're successful as a keeper. And for that reason, if you've just gotten boas, you should, even if you have kind of in the back of your head you want to breed them someday, you probably shouldn't go announcing this, and you probably shouldn't be using this as the guiding principle. You should really just be worried about the husbandry and really learning how to take care of these animals properly. The next is to pick boas that have a good market. Okay, boas in general do have a good market compared to some of the other herps, like normal ball pythons, or maybe I'm guessing things like bearded dragons and leopard geckos. I honestly don't know what the market is like for these species, but I would guess, because there's so many people working with them and they're so ubiquitous at reptile shows, that there's really not that great of a market. So you probably don't want to breed animals that people don't want and that it's going to be hard to find homes for, something like a normal ball python. So really think carefully, should you be breeding these animals? If you're successful breeding the animals, are you going to be able to find homes for the babies? And is it a species that people really want? That's a very important consideration there. Fortunately, in today's environment, most locality boas, it's relatively easy to find homes for them because there's so few of them out there. Don't give up, as I mentioned. Persistence is really probably the most important single thing that you need to be a successful boa breeder, and the vast majority of people who fail is because they give up. And then the last tip to keep in mind, don't do it for the money. Okay, and I know nobody says they do it for the money, at least not primarily. If you're breeding boas because of the money as a primary consideration, there are a lot of things that are much easier to make money at than breeding boas, and you'll be a lot more guaranteed of a return on investment than breeding boas, and it's a lot less work. All kinds of investments, investing in the stock market, for example. But if you want to breed boas, really don't think about it in terms of the money. It can be tempting to see the prices that some of these animals sell for and think, well, I could be doing that and making the money. But trust me, it's a hell of a lot harder and more involved than it looks. And the people that are making that kind of money, you don't see all of the investments that they had to put in that lost money to get to that point. Okay, so you might think, $1,000 for a boa, that's a hell of a lot of money. But when you look at all of the things a person has been through to get to that $1,000 boa, maybe it's really not all that much. So I'll leave that for some food for thought. I hope this video was helpful. As always, I'd love to hear your opinions on breeding and who should be breeding in the comments below. And feel free to also shoot me any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.